So welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Krupel and I'm the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and will be available on the UFCES website. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and participants are encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screens. And please not use the chat window, as it's much easier to monitor and moderate if the questions are within the Q&A. Thank you very much for joining us today for Money Well Spent, Assessing the Impact of EU Regional Development Fund Spending on Support for the EU. Again, this talk is part of our Lunchtime Symposium series. CES hosts 3 to 4 lunchtime symposiums per semester for faculty and advanced graduate students to present current research on Europe from any discipline. If you have a European topic that you would like to present, please contact Carla Ruffer at rufferc@ufl.edu to schedule a presentation for fall or spring of the next academic year. And we'll post that email in the chat so that those who are interested can have it. Our speaker today is Michael Webb. Mike is a UF Ph.D. candidate in political science. His research interest is in political discontent, populism, the structural factors that drive contemporary change in political systems, and the US and European and EU institutions. Specifically, the informal agenda setting capacity of the European Parliament in terms of EU institutional research. His current work focuses on the usefulness of varying measures of industry mixture as a determination of economic voting behavior. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Marcel Lewandowsky moderating today's Q&A session and providing an introduction to the presentation. Dr. Lewandowsky is a DAAD visiting assistant professor with CES at UF, and his research and teaching focuses on comparative politics with special regard to parties and party systems, populism in Europe, and the political system in Germany. As a reminder, as you leave today's event, you will be taken directly to an event survey, and we ask that you kindly take a moment or two to complete that survey to provide us important feedback on our events. And with that, I will hand the virtual microphone over to Dr. Lewandowsky. And there you are. I will mute myself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krupel, for the kind introduction. There's just some things I want to say. Actually, what I want to stress is that Mike Webb's presentation is going to touch upon one of the, I would say, one of the most important research gaps that is still out there, which is the attitudes towards the European Union, economic voting, and European policy. For example, we know about attitudes towards the European Union. We might know how socioeconomic status, for example, might influence voting behavior, but there's still not so much knowledge about how European or policies of the EU, especially at the local and regional level that we're going to focus at today, are going to or potentially influencing voting behavior and attitudes. So I'm really looking forward to this insightful presentation, Mike. Whenever you are ready, please share your screen. I will collect the questions that come up in the Q&A. And after your presentation, which is going to take 35 minutes, we are going to have a discussion about that. So I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Michael Webb. I'm a graduate student at the University of Florida. I just want to say thank you to CES for allowing me to give this talk today and share my work. Today I'll be presenting an ongoing project that I'm working on, which I've titled Money Well Spent, Assessing the Impact of EU Regional Fund Spending on Support for the EU. And the principal focus of this project is the question, does the European Union's Regional Development Fund spend affect support for the European Union? But it's a hard one to approach without any context. The next section that I'm going to sort of step into is focused on giving you all the context you need to understand this question and to allow us to approach my analysis with a better sense of its significance. The 21st century has been labeled by geographers and economists and sociologists, people from all over the spectrum of the social sciences, as the century of cities. And it's sort of easy to understand why. We have these almost like megalopolises, such as London, Paris, Berlin. In the United States, we have New York, LA, Chicago, that dominate the surrounding countryside. And in the case of cities like London or Paris, the country entirely. Paris, more specifically Ile-de-France, which is the region where Paris is located, is actually the only region in France that has grown above the average rate of growth for the country in the last 25 years. So these are cities that have benefited tremendously from what has been a sort of global pattern of rapid urbanization, which has helped to create tremendous wealth, but which has also altered the structure of our economies, not just in terms of the way that wealth is distributed between individuals, but also the way that wealth is distributed across regions. And while circumstance has probably played a role in that, and certainly has, it's a pattern of development which is at least partly by design. So the design that I was just referring to is actually a development, a school of economics which focuses on a concept known as agglomeration. And agglomeration economies, as the quote that I've highlighted here on the slide says, are those benefits that come when firms and people locate near one another together in cities and industrial center clusters. And ultimately, the main factors driving this growth, which comes from that kind of concentration, are lower transportation costs and knowledge spillovers, which is the idea that individuals will benefit from the innovation of other individuals that are geographically proximate to them. And this has been sort of generally received by economists and economic geographers as being at least prior to the last 5 years or so, a sort of universally good thing. Large cities have created opportunities for greener living, have made us richer, have allowed us to advance technologies at faster rates. And you can think of places like Silicon Valley. But there's a flip side to this, which is that for those regions that are not the agglomeration centers, the places where the benefits of this particular style of economic development are concentrated, wealth has slowly trickled out towards the center, and the periphery has been made weaker and weaker as a consequence. This map that I'm sharing with you is of overperformers and underperformers in the European Union. Underperformers are those regions that are growing at a rate lower than the average for their country. And so you can see from the pattern on the map that with the exception of northern Italy and southern Germany, most places that are growing quickly are large cities. So you can see London in the south of England, Paris, Madrid, Dublin. These are spaces that have benefited tremendously from an emphasis on driving economies of scale, which was a conscious decision on the part of governments in Europe. And the reason that agglomeration has been sort of conceived as being a universally good thing is that it was originally thought that there are two principal mechanisms allowing for the redistribution of the wealth that is concentrated in the cities. And these two principal mechanisms are labor mobility, which is the idea that workers can travel to places where economic opportunity arises, and knowledge spillovers. Labor mobility and the idea that workers are traveling to meet economic opportunity is a little bit problematic because in reality, not all workers are actually able to travel. What happens is that high-skilled workers will move to places where there are economic opportunity, leaving low-skilled workers stuck in spaces where where those individuals who might have helped the area to sort of move itself forward have left to go to greener pastures. Knowledge spillovers, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, it's the idea that proximate innovation will drive innovation will drive additional innovation, the Silicon Valley effect, if you will, has proven to be not as potent a redistributive mechanism as people thought it was going to be. Studies have suggested that in reality, the benefits of knowledge spillovers are limited to about 200 kilometers from the urban space where the research and development driving that innovation is concentrated. So ultimately, 200 kilometers, for those who aren't familiar with kilometers, is about 120 miles. So for a country like Germany, especially for countries like the US, if we look outside of Europe, those agglomeration benefits are a little bit harder to appreciate than was originally anticipated. And it's also the case that states can succeed without supercities. And Germany, Northern Italy are great examples of spaces that have become economically wealthy and have done so through a collection of medium-sized cities. And of course, Berlin would be the exception to that in Germany, but Berlin is in East Germany, and Eastern Germany's development is sort of not typical of what the rest of Germany, Western Germany, has experienced. So this economic inequality that I was just talking about, which manifests in specific patterns geographically, is not isolated to the inequality and the tension that it creates, the communal deterioration which comes as a consequence of the economic struggle that peripheral regions are currently engaged in, does not limit itself to the economy. In fact, it's been shown to bleed out into politics and into the way our society manifests. We see a rise of a sort of a backlash culture in Europe and in the US. And these two maps that I'm presenting in this slide are, on the left, you have Germany, which is the results of the 2017 Bundestag elections with support for the AfD. And you can see that support for the AfD is clearly concentrated in Germany. And right there in the middle, the lighter blue dot where support is lower is actually Berlin. So we have this pattern of, and it's not to say that there aren't other cities in Germany. We have Dresden, for example. And what we can see is that those cities don't have that same resistance to the AfD, to the anti-establishment appeal of a party like the AfD that a place like Berlin does. And that is a reflection of this separation, both economically and politically, between cities that are at the center of what we might call the new economy, like Berlin, like London, like Paris, like New York, and those cities and those rural spaces which are not. On the right side, it's a similar pattern. You can see that London, which is dark blue, voted for heavily to remain, while other cities in northern parts of the UK and rural spaces in the UK chose to leave the EU and ultimately were successful in driving that forward. And of course, the same pattern is here in the United States. We have sort of huge swaths of the country which swung right for and voted for President Trump, or former President Trump, while urban spaces in those same areas, like Chicago, did not. And it's a consistent pattern which we can sort of observe graphically here in the United States, in Germany, and the UK, but it goes beyond those graphical presentations. Regional economic factors, such as declining wage growth or declining manufacturing employment or exposure to cheaper goods from China, have all been tied to political polarization, support for right-wing nationalists, a desire to leave the European Union. And so we can see that the patterns of regional economic development, which at first sight may seem like they're sort of disjoined from the political competition which takes place at the national level, actually do have significant implications for the way that politics plays out. So before we jump back to the question that I was previously talking about, I think it's worth taking a moment to talk about what countries can do to address the regional inequality, which, as I've sought to demonstrate, is a factor in driving political polarization, support for anti-establishment parties. And one example of an effort to mitigate political or regional economic inequality is the European Regional Development Fund, which, as I mentioned at the start, is the focus of my paper. And so the ERDF is just one of a series of funds that's meant to help bring lagging regions in Europe up to speed. But unlike other funds, which focus on things like infrastructure with aiming to create highways to increase labor mobility, which in turn allows individuals living in rural spaces to move to those areas where there are greater economic opportunity, they actually seek to foster economic opportunity in the places that the individuals are currently living, and to try and mitigate the gap between those more peripheral regions and the ones that are growing quickly at the center. And this is a pretty sizable project. As you can see down at the bottom, I've highlighted that between 2000 and 2013, the EU spent roughly 417 billion euros, allocated and then spent over the course of that period, 417 billion euros in an effort to mitigate regional inequality, with a focus on some themes which are aimed to create development which would be sustainable in the long term in these areas. And just to give you guys some examples, in Wales, which is a historically underdeveloped region in the UK, but is also it's an underdeveloped region in comparison to any part of the EU. It's very underdeveloped, and it has a really hard time fostering industry, especially in the northern and northwestern sections of the country. The ERDF has sought to create sought to help the Welsh to monetize their culture and create the kind of tourist industry that Ireland benefits from. So they fund the maintenance of landmarks, the opening of new landmarks, the creation of tourist centers. In Eastern Europe, places like Hungary, the ERDF has funded large-scale solar plants. So these are solar farms, which the ERDF will invest $30 to $35 million in constructing for a single project. And then also, to give another example, in rural Finland, in Lapland, the ERDF is actively engaged in helping young people to foster IT skills to allow them to engage in a digital economy without actually leaving the areas that they were born in. So, with all of that said, we can come back to the question of, does the European Union's Regional Development Fund spend affect support for the European Union? Given we now understand that regional economic inequality has been tied to political changes in voting behavior, then it stands to reason that efforts on the part of governments, be they supranational institutions like the European Union or a domestic institution working with the European Union, may actually serve to mitigate support for anti-establishment parties, or to just foster support for mainstream parties. So I'm not the first person to study structural fund spending, although a lot of the work that has been done in the last couple of years. Andres Rodriguez Pose, who is an economic geographer, at the London School of Economics, and his co-author who works at the Commission. So they have the really good data. It's hard to compete with the Commission for detailed nuts theory analysis. But they focus on national elections. And while European Parliament elections, I should say that the analysis that I'll be performing and the data that I'll talk about later is focused on the European Parliament. Andres Rodriguez-Poze and his co-author have focused on national elections. And while national elections are useful, they do, I would argue, tend to be more focused on national issues than European issues. And some would say that European Parliament elections are second order, but the success of Eurosceptic parties in EP elections, such as UKIP, for example, suggests that the focus in these elections is more on Europe than it is during national elections. So even if EP elections as second order elections are influenced by non-Europe related matters, they still point more directly to attitudes on Europe than national elections. So if we're interested in understanding how European Regional Development Fund spending affects support for the European Union, then European Parliament elections are a good place to start from an econometric perspective. It's also worth noting that there has been work done on European Parliament elections. So Hensroth and Oganessian, I'm sorry, I definitely mispronounced that, investigate EP elections, but they do so from an economic voting perspective, which draws attention away from the Europe-focused character of EP elections. They're more interested in the capacity of incumbent parties to use ERDF spending to drive support, drive support for themselves during elections, instead of actual support for the EU. So my work here, which seeks to expand on the work that these authors have done, will focus on the regional success of parties that strongly support the EU during European Parliament elections. And as I will show, we'll leverage a more complete set of European election results than has been used previously. My decision to focus on support for the EU as opposed to Euroscepticism, which was what Andres Rodriguez-Poze and his co-author focused on, is a deliberate one. Eurosceptic parties tend to vary both in terms of their degree of Euroscepticism and in terms of their ideologies. And being a supporter of the EU, on the other hand, forces parties to tie themselves to a specific set of policies and views that come with the sort of the real manifestation of the supranational institutions of the EU. And it's also worth noting that just because voters don't support Eurosceptic parties doesn't necessarily mean that they support the EU. So to understand whether or not ERDF spend is driving support for the European Union, we need to take a look at which parties are actively supporting the EU in their policy platforms. This is just my sort of the principal hypothesis of my work. You can't guess what I'm going to be arguing at this point. Given what we already know about the capacity of ERDF spending to mitigate support for Euroscepticism, I expect to find that ERDF spend will have a positive and significant effect on support for the EU and the electorate. So you may have noticed, I didn't highlight it, the other authors that worked with the EP elections worked using an incomplete data set. And there's a reason for that, which is that the EU, while it does mandate that every member state provide detailed reporting of their European Parliament elections, does not provide any single hub for users to be able to access all of that data at once. And so that's actually a big part of this project for me, has been to try and create a complete set of European Parliament elections for the periods from 2009 to 2019 at the NUTS 2 level. For those of you who don't know what the NUTS 2 level means, in the European Union, they have administrative districts in the same way that we have states and counties. And the NUTS 2 level correlates roughly with the county in the States, in the United States. And there's a reason that nobody has done this before, and it's because some of these websites present this information in a rather frustrating way. Poland, for example, provides very detailed information, but it provides it at the voting site level. And if you want to be able to use that voting information in relation to information provided by the European Union on the economic or demographic characteristics of those regions, you have to go about collecting 30,000 plus election results, which is not an easy feat to achieve manually. And adding on to this is the fact that most of these websites are presented, not unreasonably, in the language, the native language of the state. Some of them provide English options, but some of them do not, which thankfully for me, Google Translate is a thing. And I think it's also worth noting that this lack of a consolidated source of EP election results is probably one of the reasons why EP elections have remained relatively understudied. Obviously, they are second order elections. For anyone who doesn't know what second order elections are, they are elections that are typically have lower turnout rates and which are influenced by factors beyond the particular focus of the election. So in this instance, it would be the fact that national political matters influence outcomes in EP elections. Returning to the data, the way that I've gone about collecting data for this project is to create web scraping programs in Java, which leverage the Selenium framework. And gathering data from a website like Poland's would be absolutely impossible for one person without the use of data scraping techniques. I guess it wouldn't be impossible, but it would take you months. And then at the end of it, you would only have the European Parliament election results for Poland, which are interesting in their own right, but maybe not enough to incentivize you to engage in that task. And these programs can take data collection that would take weeks or months and complete it in a matter of days or even hours. And I write mine in Java, but if there is anyone out there who's interested in this kind of thing, I would really recommend Selenium because it's available in most languages, including Python, which I know is really popular with grad students. And so, like I mentioned, this is a work in progress. I currently have data for the 2009 and 2014 elections. And I pair that data with data provided by the Commission for the ERDF spending that was allocated at the NUTS 2 level for the periods between 2000 and 2006, 2007, 2013, and then also a general 2000 to 2013 spending period. And as I mentioned before, I'm interested, oh, well, I guess I'll move on to the dependent variable on the next slide, so I'll come back to that. But I just want to point out that the control variables that I'm using are more or less typical for econometric analyses of this sort. So we have control for gender levels, age, education. Race would be typical in the United States, but Europe doesn't provide that kind of data. And then more traditional economic variables in which in economic voting are very common. So GDP per capita, change in unemployment, change in GDP, net migration. So for those who aren't familiar, migration is often viewed as a proxy for wage growth because, like we mentioned, labor mobility is an expected redistributive mechanism in the context of changing Western economies. And then we also have population density because we want to be able to account for the large cities, which are indicative of the economic transformation that we're trying to account for in this analysis. So returning to my dependent variable, as I mentioned, I'm interested in looking at support for the EU, and I've gone about calculating support in EP elections by pairing the European Parliament election results that I've gathered with CHESS data on the attitudes of the parties in those elections on the EU, along with the ensuring that those parties are both very positive about the EU and its role in their country and their role in it, and also that the EU is a salient factor for those countries in their platform. Because we don't want to have a country which is nominally supportive of the EU, but not necessarily super focused on it. I then divide the sum of EU positive votes in each election by the size of the electorate in the same year. I've chosen the electorate as opposed to the relative number of votes because the EU is a second order election, it generally has lower turnout. And also because simply having more votes than the Eurosceptics in the election does not reflect necessarily an increase in support for the EU if the total number of votes cast in the election have gone down in that year. That's sort of something that came up fairly frequently in American politics after the 2016 election, when people were talking about how Donald Trump won with fewer votes than Mitt Romney lost with. So when we're talking about the proportion of votes won, we have to be careful to consider the fact that lots of people choose to abstain and not vote for either candidate. So this is my analysis. The table here offers 3 different models that are identical except for changes in the values used to represent ERDF spending. It's also worth noting that each of the ERDF spending figures has been transformed. The first model looks at spending from the 2000 to 2006 period. The second looks at spending from the 2007 to 2013 period. And the third looks at cumulative spend across both periods. The results seem to suggest that my expectations around the impact of ERDF spending on support for the EU in the electorate have been supported, but the more distant spending, like the 2006 spending, because it's a spending period from 2000 to 2006, and the election we're focused on is 2014, some of that spending is 14 years old at this point, and it seems reasonable to suspect that its impact has been diminished. It certainly doesn't have the kind of significant effect that ERDF spending from the 2007 to 2013 period had. And while I won't go into too much detail here, it's worth noting that all of the coefficients for the continuous variables here have been scaled so that they can be compared more easily. And so a 1 standard deviation change in 2013 European Regional Development Fund spending is roughly equivalent to a 1 standard deviation change in the % of the population in a given region that has a tertiary education, that's a college education. And so that's a pretty significant effect. And given the place that education has in influencing voting behavior. And so I'm happy to come back to this later and talk about some of these other controls, but they're not really the focus of the analysis, so I'm gonna skip over them here for the sake of time. Next steps for me in this analysis, obviously I want to be able to finish the data set. As I mentioned, I want to have a complete data set of all of the countries in the EU running from 2009 to 2019. I think it'll make for a more substantive analysis. I also have intended to include and had intended to include for this, but it was a bit too much of a work in progress to share. Individual level voting behavior, an analysis of individual level voting behavior, because obviously my work here has focused on the electorate. And it would be really interesting, I think, to try and get a sense of what's driving individuals and what sort of characteristics might lead them to be more supportive of the EU and what effect the ERDF has on that process. And then also, I think it's probably worth re-examining my dependent variable. I know in survey-based voting studies that are seeking to look at abstentions, they've used multinomial logit or multinomial probit analyses. And so that's something that I sort of came across recently and that I feel like I need to consider, but I would definitely love to hear everybody else's thoughts on this. Like I said, it's a bit of a work in progress, but I'm really happy that I was allowed to share it here today.
Thank you very, very much, Mike, for this insightful and really thick and rich presentation. I think there's a lot that we can discuss here. Mike, the first question, I can just read it to everybody, so it might be easier for those who are not seeing the screen. In your research, have you encountered the historical tensions that arise when bleeding the rich to pay for the development of the poor? I'm thinking about tensions in the crumbling Yugoslav Federation when Slovenia, the richest republic, left first, partly in protest to having to subsidize the poorer regions like Kosovo, as well as some pushes for decentralization in Latin American countries hit by the pink wave early this century. Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I can speak to the specific examples that you're citing here, but I think that definitely is a factor. In Europe, for instance, Northern Italy, especially, which is a very wealthy region, is unhappy having to subsidize its poorer southern, less productive counterparts, but also other parts of the EU. And I think there are other places as well. I know that's been a factor in Germany too. Places like Bavaria, that there is tension because, like you see it in the Euro crisis, the dynamic of like the irresponsible Southerner, right? There are regions, this occurs not simply internally within countries, and it certainly does occur internally within countries, but also across regions. Northern states and the notion of the irresponsible Southern governments, I think, are a great example of the sorts of tensions that you're talking about.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Tertiary education is interesting to take into account. Does this include something like trade schools or polytechnics? Do you think there are important differences to be made by distinguishing these different types of tertiary schools, or does it largely yield the same results?
I think that's a really good point. I think it's a tough question. The variable that I created to account for tertiary education does not include trade schools or vocational schools, but in a place like Germany where individuals are encouraged to move into trade schools and vocational schools, obviously we don't really have that in the US, but there are other countries that do. And I think it is something worth accounting for. So I think in the future, I may actually try and adjust the education variable to include that and see what the effect is.
Amy, go ahead, please.
Sure. I'm wondering if you think, as we have your time section right now is pretty limited, but the impact and the use of structural and cohesion funds, which is effectively what you're including, has changed over time as enlargement has occurred, and in particular as they have shifted more towards the east. And I'm wondering if there might be some concern that those regions that used to benefit more from structural and cohesion funds will actually respond negatively to the absence of structural and cohesion funds as they have shifted and been reduced. And I would also ask if you'd thought about similar processes with common agricultural policy spending and subsidies.
So to your first point, I haven't actually looked at the shift in I've looked at it, but I haven't taken that much time to focus on the patterns and the shifting investments, because there are regions in wealthier states, like pretty much every region in the EU will receive some level of funding, and that funding tends to be more structured for the more developed spaces. But and obviously it's much larger for those areas that are underdeveloped, like there are regions in Eastern states that came in with the Eastern enlargement that have, they received, in excess of $1 billion, which I think was your point. So they're getting a lot more of the attention. But I guess it's an interesting question. Will those regions that once were, the underdeveloped regions now feel like they've been passed over because they've become the transitional regions in the face of new, truly underdeveloped regions? That's probably something I should look into and see if there's some kind of like lag effect where if you used to get a lot of funding and now you don't get so much funding, do you see a sort of a bitterness there? And then in relation to the cap spending, yes, I have thought about that. I am interested in that. I've looked at agricultural employment and share of agriculture as a percentage of GDP in NUTS regions before. And that does have a positive effect on support for the EU. I think probably because those spaces that are highly reliant upon agriculture appreciate what CAP is doing. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
I would think you could just put in a control variable for, has there been a loss of like a decrease in structural and cohesion funds, right, in that particular region, and it could be a 1 or a 0, and just to see if that has any effect.
I have another question right here that speaks strongly to Dr. Krupel's question. It goes like, you mentioned expanding the timeframe covered, but from what you see now, do you expect to see a continued effect of ERDF on support for pro-EU parties, or is this a one-off effect on electoral results? Once the ERDF programs are less prominent or end, will the effect remain? So it's a little more detailed than a question before, but maybe you can speculate on that.
Yeah, so I think, it's a great question. And I would say to that ERDF spending's effect is, and another paper that Dr. Lewandowsky has read that I did on this, ERDF spending's effect is mitigated by rising GDP in regions. So the richer you are, the less ERDF spending tends to affect your perspective on the EU, because obviously, I guess, the less grateful you are for because you're better off already. But at the same time, being better off also makes you less likely to vote for anti-establishment parties. And so in that sense, the ERDF funding is if it's serving an effective purpose and that purpose has been achieved, then the effect of the ERDF spending has been sort of translated into the characteristics of the state, which then in turn affect the voting behavior.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of voting behavior, there's another question in the Q&A here, which highlights another aspect here that is pretty important. It says, to what extent is the rise of anti-migrant fears in many member states serving as a factor that might shape attitudes toward the EU and reduce the impact of the structural funding and attitudes as it did in the Brexit vote?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There is that one paper, I can't remember who wrote it, but it basically shows that the spending from the EU in the UK in relation to the Brexit referendum did not have the effect that it's been shown to have in European Parliament elections. So I really don't think you can underestimate the importance of the cultural narratives of these sort of like moments when, say, for example, in the midst of the refugee crisis, which is something that I can't really speak to in the context of the data that I have right now, but which perhaps I might be able to later. Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. You think about the way that the AfD transformed itself to take advantage of the refugee crisis. and shifted its focus and effectively just became another party altogether with different attitudes in relation to the EU and better able to sort of capture the imagination of the electorate. Those things have to be accounted for. And I think it's another narrative, one which has to be sort of addressed in addition to this. I mean, these are two, obviously, because it's interesting, right? You have like, with the coronavirus and the pandemic, populist parties have sort of had and anti-establishment parties have had the wind sucked out of their sails because they've been presented with a problem that, you know, blaming minorities for is not a super effective way of managing. And so, of course, when we have moments like the refugee crisis, which stokes migrant fears, that's something that's going to have to be accounted for. But ultimately, I think those things like the refugee crisis, are more temporally bound than the need to develop, not the need to develop, but the extent to which varying levels of development can affect political attitudes. Because if you live in a poor region, an obscure poor region of, say, like Northern Wales, for example, once the refugee crisis is over, you're still living in Northern Wales, and you still have the same economic problems that you had before. And so I think it's a different kind of problem in a way. It's one that the time frame for it is a little bit longer, and perhaps it's a little bit less dynamic in terms of the impact that it has on the electorate. But it's still very much there, and still very much something that has to be accounted for.
Since at this point there are no further questions, I make use of a prerogative that I have as a moderator and ask a question myself. I would like to echo what was just asked about voting behavior. And in a way, I want to challenge some of your claims, if you don't mind, Mike. One is, are we really looking at economic voting here? Or to be more precise, can we really say that economic factors are influencing voting behavior to the extent we think they do? For example, for the United States, Schaffner and others have found that, yes, it is blue-collar workers, white blue-collar workers that are voting, that have been voting a Republican in 2016 election, but it's white-collar workers with specific attitudes that are doing so. And these attitudes are widely explaining the voting behavior more than the economic status does. And then to a similar extent, this has been found for European parties, especially populist radical right parties, which are the most Eurosceptical parties, right? So there's an interesting paper by Rodin, 2018, who says that all other aspects considered, Euroscepticism does explain voting behavior only in two national elections, in this case, which is in Switzerland, not even part of the EU, and in Denmark. And in all other cases, when it comes to populist radical right parties, the effect of Euroscepticism seems to disappear when we take other attitudes, especially racism, or in a broader sense, negative attitudes against migration, into account. So what I'm asking is, would you really say that we're looking at the outcome of economically influenced voting, or is that something else going on here that is more explained by attitudes that we are finding in a specific social group?
Well, I'm not familiar with the Rodin paper, but my favorite papers on this topic tend to be they tend to use both the kind of econometric analysis that I've used here and survey data and sort of marry them together. Mm-hmm. And what's been found pretty consistently across several papers is that, yes, attitudes matter, and yes, those attitudes influence voting behavior, but those attitudes are themselves aggravated by economic conditions. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges of surveyed data is that sampling effectively across huge regions with varied economic experiences is is a really difficult thing to do. And so in a sense, when we look at survey data, we should take it with the same grain of salt that we do when we look at econometric data, right? The one is looking at the patterns which emerge at from a bird's eye view, which are there and are observed and correlate with economic effects. And the other is looking at the specific dynamics of individual behavior, which when cumulatively added up will ostensibly manifest those bird's eye view patterns that we've observed. And so in that sense, I guess I would say that I would not say that this is not an economic issue. I think it absolutely is an economic issue. It's an economic issue that interacts with the cultural issues that we're currently experiencing. It's Danny Roderick, who's an economist and who has sort of like addressed this before, points out that, I mean, like people were racist before 2016. These attitudes are not new. If anything, they're lower in the general population than they've ever been. And so a constant is can't really explain this change. And the thing that is changing dramatically in our world today is the economy. That technology, the way that wealth is distributed, all of those things interact with all of these cultural narratives that we have to produce, I think, the politics that we have today. And it is to say that we can't simply look at cultural explanations and say it's all culture, and we can't simply look at economic explanations and say, oh, it's all economics. It has to necessarily be both, because they both do play a role in informing political behavior.
Thank you very much, Mike. We have one more question in the Q&A. Related to one of the previous questions, I wonder if you've considered disaggregating net migration within your model. Regardless, do you anticipate any effect on economic voting behavior by immigrant inflow versus immigrant outflow? Moreover, would you suspect any differences with respect to the origin of the migration flow? For example, migration from Poland versus migration from Morocco versus migration from Turkey?
So I would suspect that the where the migrants are from matters. That data is hard to find, and detailed data is hard to find. It's definitely at the European level, even at a given country, it's difficult to find. But my experience working with the broken out migration data is that it doesn't have that effect that you'd expect, because I was able to get the proportion of migration which was accounted for by foreigners in another analysis that I did, and it didn't have that effect. But I mean, this is entirely anecdotal. I don't have anything that any real legs to stand on here. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and it's something that could definitely be given more consideration. Because I mentioned earlier that migration as it stands, not just in terms of like the ethnic origin of the migrants, but also in terms of their economic status. Those things really do vary, and they do have a consequence. But it's also the case that for the most part, the people who are migrating, especially within Europe, Europeans moving within Europe, tend to be a little bit wealthier, a little bit better educated, a little bit more able to move themselves and improve their condition than the ones that get like left behind, to use that phrase that gets used all the time.
Okay, so on the Brexit vote, the most supportive voters for staying in the EU were younger voters, but they also were the same people with a low turnout. Is this case elsewhere in Europe? Is this the case elsewhere in Europe?
Well, I would need to look. I could definitely get back to you and check on that. Anecdotally, I know Dr. Krapel loves to talk about the young Poles who voted Donald Tusk in. So I think it will vary from country to country, from election to election, depending on the context, depending on the capacity of any given party to actively activate the youth vote. But as a general rule, yes, the pattern is that old people turn out, and older people, I should say, turn out, and younger people tend not to, for any number of reasons, be it not having vested interests in society yet, be it, having less free time, whatever it is.
Thank you, Mike. As there is no further question from my side, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for the super interesting Q&A. Also, to all of those who have engaged in the discussion, I think it was very fruitful. From my side, thank you very much. I don't know whether CES would like to.
Thank you, Dr. Lewandowsky, for moderating, and Mike Webb for participating, and thanks to everyone who attended. Keep a lookout on the CES website for additional events and for the recording of this event and other events. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.